The year is 1736, and in a modest house on Crawford Street in Greenock, Scotland, a child draws his first breath who will one day transform the world. But this is not the story you think you know. This is not the simple tale of a man who improved a steam engine. This is the complete life of James Watt, a story of genius and heartbreak, of revolutionary ideas born from desperate necessity, and of a mind so brilliant it would reshape the very foundations of human civilization. Most people know James Watt as the man whose name graces the unit of power, the Watt. They know him as the inventor who made the steam engine efficient. But what they don't know is the extraordinary journey that led him there. The childhood illness that nearly killed him, but gave him the solitude to develop his incredible mind. The financial struggles that drove him to the brink of despair. The personal tragedies that would have broken a lesser man. And the moment of revelation that changed everything. Not just for him, but for every person alive today. Because you see, without James Watt, there would be no industrial revolution as we know it. No factories powered by steam, no locomotives racing across continents, no ships crossing oceans with mechanical precision. The world we inhabit today, with all its technological marvels, traces its lineage directly back to the innovations of this one remarkable man. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that house in Greenock, to a Scotland that was still finding its identity after the union with England, to a world where power meant wind, water and muscle, nothing more. Let me show you how a sickly child with an insatiable curiosity would grow up to unleash forces that would transform human existence itself. James Watt was born on January 19th, 1736, the son of Agnes Muirhead and James Watt Sr. His father was a successful shipwright and contractor, a man who understood the intricate mechanics of building vessels that could withstand the fierce Scottish seas. The Watt household was one of modest prosperity, filled with the tools of craftsmanship and the smell of wood shavings and metal filings. But young James was not destined for the robust life of a shipbuilder. From his earliest years, he was plagued by chronic headaches and general ill health that kept him confined indoors for long stretches. While other children ran through the streets of Greenock playing and exploring, James sat by the window, watching the world through glass, his mind already beginning to work in ways that would set him apart forever. His mother, Agnes, recognized something special in her frail son. She saw how his eyes lit up when he examined the mechanical toys his father brought home, how he could sit for hours taking apart and reassembling clocks and watches with a patience that seemed beyond his years. Where other parents might have worried about a child who preferred solitude and mechanical puzzles to rough play, Agnes encouraged James's curiosity. The family workshop became young James's university. His father's tools became his textbooks. By the age of 6, he could use a hammer and chisel with remarkable skill. By 8, he was creating his own mechanical devices, crude but ingenious contraptions that hinted at the revolutionary mind developing within that sickly frame. But it was not just mechanical aptitude that marked James Watt as extraordinary. His intellectual hunger was voracious. He devoured books on mathematics, philosophy, and natural science with an intensity that concerned his parents. Here was a child who taught himself geometry by studying Euclid, who mastered Latin and Greek, not because he was forced to, but because he was driven by an insatiable need to understand the world around him. The local school in Greenock proved inadequate for James's rapidly expanding mind. His teacher, John Marr, quickly realized he was dealing with a student unlike any he had encountered. While other children struggled with basic arithmetic, James was solving complex mathematical problems that challenged university students. While they memorized Latin conjugations, he was reading Virgil and Cicero for pleasure. This intellectual precocity came with a price. James found it difficult to relate to children his own age. His interests were too advanced, his mind too focused on abstract problems that meant nothing to his peers. He became increasingly isolated, spending more and more time alone with his books and his mechanical experiments. His father, James Watt Sr., watched his son's development with a mixture of pride and concern. He could see the extraordinary potential in the boy, but he also understood the practical realities of 18th century Scotland. Genius was all well and good, but a man needed a trade, a way to make his living in the world. The question that haunted the Watt household was simple. What was to become of James? The answer began to emerge when James was in his early teens. His mathematical abilities had developed to such a degree that he was helping his father with complex calculations for shipbuilding projects. His understanding of mechanics was so intuitive that he could spot flaws in designs that escaped experienced craftsmen. And his skill with instruments, precision tools required for navigation and measurement, was becoming legendary among the shipwrights of Greenock. It was this last talent that would determine James's immediate future. In 18th century Britain, the creation of mathematical and scientific instruments was a specialized trade requiring both theoretical knowledge and practical skill. These instruments, quadrants and compasses, barometers and telescopes, were essential tools for navigation, surveying and scientific research. They required precision manufacturing that pushed the boundaries of contemporary craftsmanship. James's father recognized that instrument making might be the perfect profession for his intellectually gifted but physically frail son. It would allow James to use his mathematical knowledge, satisfy his mechanical curiosity, and earn a respectable living, all while working indoors where his health problems would be less of an impediment. But there was a problem. Greenock, for all its maritime importance, was not a centre of instrument making. The finest instrument makers in Britain worked in London, in workshops that guarded their secrets jealously and took on apprentices only through personal connections and substantial fees. For a Scottish shipwright's son, no matter how talented, the barriers seemed insurmountable. Yet James Watt Sr. was not a man easily discouraged. He had built his business through determination and careful planning, and he applied the same approach to his son's future. He began making inquiries, using his contacts in the shipping trade to identify potential opportunities. He saved money, preparing for the substantial expense of sending James to London for training. Meanwhile, James continued his self-education with characteristic intensity. He studied every mathematical and scientific text he could find. He practiced with every instrument that came through his father's workshop. He experimented with metalworking techniques, teaching himself to achieve the precision that instrument making would require. As James approached his 18th birthday, his father's plans began to crystallize. Through a network of Scottish merchants and sea captains, contact had been made with John Morgan, a respected instrument maker in Cornhill, London. Morgan was willing to consider taking on a Scottish apprentice, provided the young man could demonstrate adequate skill and the family could afford the premium required for training someone from outside London's traditional craft networks. The decision to send James to London was not made lightly. It would separate the family for years. It would consume much of the family's savings, and it would place a young man of fragile health and sheltered upbringing into one of the most demanding and competitive environments in Britain. But both James and his father understood that this opportunity might not come again. In London, James would learn from the finest craftsmen in the world. He would have access to the latest scientific knowledge. He would be positioned to make a living that matched his extraordinary abilities. In the spring of 1755, at the age of 19, James Watt left Scotland for the first time in his life. He carried with him a small collection of tools, letters of introduction from his father's business associates, enough money to sustain him for a few months, and a mind already brimming with ideas that would one day change the world. The journey to London was itself a revelation. James had lived his entire life in the relatively small world of Greenock, where the most complex machinery was found in the shipyards, and the most sophisticated science was practical navigation. London was different in every conceivable way. It was vast, chaotic, and alive with commercial and intellectual energy that James had never imagined. The city was home to over 500,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centres in the world. Its streets teemed with merchants and craftsmen, scholars and inventors, all pursuing opportunities that simply did not exist in provincial Scotland. The contrast with Greenock was so stark that James spent his first weeks in London simply walking the streets, absorbing the complexity of urban life and beginning to understand the scale of human ambition that the city represented. But James had not come to London as a tourist. He had come to learn a trade, and John Morgan proved to be exactly the master craftsman that James needed. Morgan's workshop in Cornhill was a temple to precision, filled with the finest tools available anywhere in Britain and stocked with materials that allowed for experimentation and innovation that would have been impossible in Scotland. Under Morgan's guidance, James began to master the intricate skills of instrument making. He learned to work metals to tolerances measured in fractions of inches. He studied the optical principles that govern the construction of telescopes and microscopes. He mastered the mathematical relationships that determine the accuracy of measuring devices. But more than technical skills, James absorbed the culture of London's scientific instrument makers. These were men who stood at the intersection of science and craftsmanship, who translated theoretical knowledge into practical tools, who served the needs of navigators and surveyors, astronomers and natural philosophers. Through Morgan's workshop, James encountered some of the leading scientific minds of his day. He met instrument users who pushed the boundaries of what was possible with existing technology. He heard discussions of scientific problems that could only be solved with better, more precise instruments. He began to understand that instrument making was not just a trade, but a form of applied science that could drive discovery and innovation. Yet even as James thrived intellectually in London, the city took a toll on his health. The air was thick with coal smoke and industrial fumes. The pace of life was relentless. The competition was fierce and the pressure to succeed was constant. James found himself working longer hours than he had ever worked before, pushing his frail constitution to its limits. After just over a year in London, James's health began to deteriorate seriously. The chronic headaches that had plagued him since childhood became more severe. He developed respiratory problems that the city's polluted air only made worse. It became clear that he could not sustain the intensity of London life indefinitely. In 1756, James made the difficult decision to return to Scotland. He had learned enough to establish himself as an instrument maker, but he had not completed the full apprenticeship that would have given him the credentials to work in London's most prestigious workshops. It was a compromise born of necessity, but it would prove to be one of the most important decisions of his life, because James Watt was returning to a Scotland that was beginning to experience its own intellectual awakening. The University of Glasgow was emerging as one of the leading centres of learning in Britain. Edinburgh was developing a reputation for scientific innovation that would soon rival London. And throughout Scotland, there was a growing demand for the kind of precision instruments that James had learned to make. The young man who returned to Scotland in 1756 was transformed from the sickly child who had left for London. He had acquired skills that placed him among the finest craftsmen in Britain. He had absorbed knowledge that positioned him at the cutting edge of 18th century science, and he had developed a confidence in his abilities that would soon lead him to tackle challenges that would reshape the world. But James Watt's greatest discoveries still lay ahead. The steam engine that would make him famous had not yet entered his life. The innovations that would drive the Industrial Revolution were still forming in his remarkable mind. The complete life of James Watt was just beginning to unfold. James Watt established himself in Glasgow in 1757, renting a small workshop near the university. But the path of an instrument maker in 18th century Scotland was fraught with obstacles that would have crushed a lesser spirit. The craft guilds of Glasgow viewed this young upstart with deep suspicion. Here was a man who had learned his trade in London, who possessed skills that threatened their established monopolies, who dared to set up shop without serving the traditional 7-year apprenticeship in their ranks. The incorporation of Hammermen, the guild that controlled metalworking trades in Glasgow, moved swiftly to shut down this threat to their authority. They declared that James had no right to practice his trade within the city boundaries. They threatened legal action. They pressured potential customers to boycott his services. For a young man already struggling with poor health and limited finances, it seemed like the end before he had truly begun. But James Watt possessed something that his persecutors had not anticipated: the protection of the University of Glasgow itself. The university had been watching this remarkable young craftsman with growing interest. Here was someone who could create and repair the delicate scientific instruments that were becoming essential to advanced research and teaching. Professor Robert Dick of the Natural Philosophy Department recognised that James represented exactly the kind of skilled support that could elevate Glasgow's scientific reputation. In a move that would prove pivotal to the history of technology, the university offered James sanctuary within its walls. They appointed him as their official instrument maker, a position that placed him beyond the reach of the city guilds, while providing him with steady income and access to the finest scientific minds in Scotland. The workshop that James established at the University of Glasgow became far more than a place of business. It evolved into an intellectual crossroads, where theoretical knowledge met practical application, where the abstract concepts of natural philosophy were transformed into tangible instruments that could measure, calculate, and discover. James threw himself into his work with characteristic intensity. He repaired telescopes for astronomy professors, calibrated balances for chemistry experiments, and created surveying instruments for geography students. But more importantly, he began to innovate. Each repair job became an opportunity to improve upon existing designs. Each new commission pushed him to solve problems that had never been tackled before. His reputation spread quickly through the Scottish intellectual community. Professors who had initially been sceptical of this young provincial craftsman found themselves amazed by his capabilities. He could not only repair instruments with unprecedented precision, but he could explain the scientific principles behind their operation with a depth of understanding that rivaled their own. The workshop became a gathering place for Glasgow's brightest minds. Joseph Black, the brilliant chemist who would later discover carbon dioxide and develop the theory of latent heat, became a regular visitor. John Robertson, the natural philosophy professor whose mathematical insights would influence a generation of scientists, spent countless hours discussing theoretical problems with James. These conversations were transformative for James Watt. Through his daily interactions with university professors, he was exposed to the cutting edge of 18th century scientific thought. He learned about the latest developments in chemistry and physics. He grappled with mathematical problems that pushed the boundaries of existing knowledge. Most importantly, he began to see how theoretical science could be applied to solve practical problems. But it was in 1759 that James encountered the challenge that would define the rest of his life. Professor John Anderson brought him a small working model of a Newcomen steam engine that had been used for teaching purposes. The model was broken, its performance so poor that it was useless for demonstration. Anderson asked James to repair it, a request that seemed routine given his growing reputation for solving mechanical problems. James approached the task with his usual methodical precision. He disassembled the model completely, studying each component with the analytical mind that had been sharpened by years of instrument making. What he discovered troubled him profoundly. The engine worked, but barely. It consumed enormous quantities of steam, to produce relatively little useful motion. The cylinder had to be alternately heated and cooled with each stroke, a process that wasted tremendous amounts of energy. As James worked to repair the model, he found himself drawn deeper into the fundamental problems of steam engine design. The Newcomen engine, invented earlier in the century by Thomas Newcomen, represented the state-of-the-art in steam technology. These engines were used primarily to pump water from mines, a crucial application that had allowed deeper excavation of coal and metal deposits across Britain. But the engines were monumentally inefficient. They required vast quantities of fuel to generate steam, and most of that steam was wasted through the heating and cooling cycle that drove their operation. Mine owners accepted this inefficiency because they had no alternative, but the enormous fuel costs meant that Newcomen engines were economically viable only in locations where coal was essentially free. James's mathematical mind immediately grasped the scale of the waste. He calculated that the engine was using several times more steam than should theoretically be necessary. The problem, he realized, lay in the fundamental design of the system. Each time the cylinder was cooled to create the vacuum that drove the piston, all the heat energy that had been used to warm the cylinder was lost. When steam was admitted for the next stroke, much of its energy went into reheating the cylinder rather than driving useful motion. The solution, when it came to James, was so elegant in its simplicity that it seemed almost inevitable in retrospect. But finding that solution required a leap of insight that separated genius from mere competence. James realized that the heating and cooling functions could be separated. The main cylinder could be kept hot continuously, while the cooling needed to create vacuum could take place in a separate chamber connected by a valve. This separate condenser, as it would come to be known, would revolutionize steam engine design. By eliminating the need to alternately heat and cool the main cylinder, it would reduce fuel consumption by roughly 3/4. An engine that had been barely economical for pumping water from coal mines would suddenly become efficient enough to power factories, mills, and eventually locomotives and ships. But the moment of insight, brilliant as it was, represented only the beginning of James's challenges. Transforming a theoretical improvement into a working engine would require years of experimentation, substantial financial investment, and engineering solutions to problems that had never been encountered before. James began his experimental work in the university workshop, using his instrument-making skills to create small-scale models that could test his theoretical improvements. The early results were promising, but inconclusive. The separate condenser clearly improved efficiency, but other problems emerged that threatened to undermine the entire concept. The precision required for effective steam engine construction pushed the boundaries of 18th century manufacturing capabilities. The cylinder had to be perfectly round and smooth, with tolerances far tighter than anything required for conventional machinery. The piston had to fit the cylinder with minimal leakage while still allowing smooth motion. The valves had to operate with split-second timing to maximize efficiency. Each of these challenges required innovative solutions. James developed new techniques for boring cylinders, creating tools that could achieve unprecedented precision in metalworking. He experimented with different materials for pistons and seals, searching for combinations that could withstand the heat and pressure of steam operation while maintaining tight fits. The financial pressures of this extended development process began to weigh heavily on James. His instrument-making business provided a modest living, but the experimental work consumed time and resources that he could barely afford. He needed funding to build full-scale prototypes, but potential investors were skeptical of improvements to a technology that was already considered mature. It was during this period of financial strain that James formed a partnership that would prove crucial to his eventual success. John Roebuck, a successful entrepreneur who had made his fortune in chemical manufacturing, recognized the revolutionary potential of James's improvements to the steam engine. Roebuck agreed to fund the development work in exchange for a share of any future profits from the improved engine design. The partnership with Roebuck provided James with the resources he needed to build his first full-scale experimental engine, but it also introduced new pressures and complications. Roebuck was a businessman who expected results, and he grew increasingly impatient as months stretched into years without a commercially viable product. The technical challenges proved more daunting than James had initially anticipated. Scaling up from small models to full-size engines revealed problems that had not been apparent in the workshop experiments. The larger engines required more precise manufacturing than existing techniques could reliably achieve. The steam pressures and temperatures involved pushed materials beyond their tested limits. James found himself working 18-hour days, alternating between theoretical calculations and hands-on experimentation. His health, never robust, began to deteriorate under the strain. The chronic headaches that had plagued him since childhood became more severe. He developed digestive problems that were almost certainly stress-related, yet through all these difficulties, James persevered with a determination that amazed those who knew him. Professor Joseph Black, who had become not just a colleague but a close friend, watched James's struggles with growing admiration. Here was a man who refused to accept defeat, who continued to innovate even when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. The breakthrough, when it finally came, emerged from an unexpected source. James had been struggling with the problem of achieving adequate vacuum in his separate condenser when he realized that injection of cold water directly into the condenser could dramatically improve its effectiveness. This insight, building on his earlier work, finally produced an engine that delivered on the theoretical promise of his design. The first successful test of James's improved steam engine took place in 1765, nearly 6 years after he had first encountered the broken Newcomen model. The engine operated with an efficiency that stunned everyone who witnessed it. Fuel consumption was reduced by approximately 75% compared to existing engines. The power output was more consistent and reliable than anything previously achieved. But even this technical triumph did not immediately translate into commercial success. The manufacturing challenges remained formidable. The precision required for effective steam engine construction demanded techniques and materials that were expensive and difficult to obtain. Potential customers, while impressed by the engine's performance, were hesitant to invest in unproven technology. James found himself caught between technical success and commercial failure. He had created an engine that was demonstrably superior to existing alternatives, but he lacked the resources to manufacture it on a scale that would make it economically attractive. The partnership with Roebuck was providing some financial support, but not enough to overcome the enormous costs of establishing steam engine manufacturing. It was during this frustrating period that personal tragedy struck James with devastating force. His wife, Margaret Miller, whom he had married in 1764, died suddenly in 1773 after childbirth complications. The loss shattered James emotionally and left him responsible for raising their young children while struggling to develop his revolutionary engine design. The combination of personal grief, financial pressure, and technical challenges might have broken a lesser man. James sank into a deep depression that lasted for months. He questioned whether the years of work on the steam engine had been worth the sacrifice. He considered abandoning the project entirely and returning to the relative security of instrument making. But the scientific community that had nurtured James would not allow his genius to be wasted. Joseph Black and other university colleagues rallied around him, providing both emotional support and practical assistance. They helped care for his children during his darkest periods. They continued to encourage his work on the steam engine, even when he had lost faith in it himself. More importantly, they helped connect James with Matthew Boulton, a Birmingham manufacturer whose Soho works represented the pinnacle of 18th century industrial organisation. Bolton had been following James's work from a distance, and he recognised that the improved steam engine represented an opportunity that could transform British manufacturing. The meeting between James Watt and Matthew Bolton in 1768 marked the beginning of one of the most successful partnerships in the history of technology. Bolton possessed the manufacturing expertise, financial resources, and commercial connections that James lacked. James brought the revolutionary technology that could make them both wealthy beyond their dreams. The partnership that formed between James Watt and Matthew Bolton was unlike anything the industrial world had seen before. Bolton's Soho Works in Birmingham was already renowned as one of the most advanced manufacturing facilities in Britain, producing everything from buttons and buckles to silver plate and decorative metalwork. But Bolton possessed something far more valuable than manufacturing capability. He had vision. Where others saw James's steam engine as merely an improved water pump, Bolton envisioned a power source that could transform every aspect of human industry. He famously declared to visitors at his works, "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have: power." This was not mere salesmanship. This was prophecy. The formal partnership agreement, signed in 1775, granted Bolton a share in James's steam engine patents in exchange for the resources needed to bring the technology to market. But more than a business arrangement, it represented the marriage of invention, an enterprise that would become the template for industrial development. Under Bolton's guidance, James relocated to Birmingham, leaving behind the academic environment of Glasgow for the rough and tumble world of manufacturing. The transition was jarring for a man accustomed to the genteel discussions of university life. Birmingham was a city of furnaces and forges, where the air was thick with smoke and the ground trembled with the rhythm of machinery. The Soho Works became James's new laboratory, but on a scale that dwarfed anything he had experienced before. Bolton employed some of the finest craftsmen in Britain, men who possessed the skills necessary to manufacture steam engines with the precision that James's designs demanded. The facility had access to the latest metalworking techniques, the most advanced tools, and a supply chain that could deliver materials from across the British Empire. Yet even with these advantages, the challenges of commercial steam engine production proved immense. Each engine was essentially a custom creation, requiring individual adjustment and modification to meet the specific needs of its application. The manufacturing tolerances were so tight that conventional quality control methods were inadequate. James found himself personally involved in the construction of every engine, checking measurements, adjusting fits, and solving problems that arose only when theoretical designs encountered practical reality. The first commercial Bolton and Watt steam engine was installed at Bloomfield Colliery in 1776, exactly 200 years before the American Revolution reached its climax. The engine's performance exceeded all expectations, pumping water from depths that had previously been impossible to reach. Word of its success spread rapidly through Britain's mining community, generating orders that stretched the partnership's manufacturing capabilities. But James was not content with simply improving the efficiency of existing applications. His restless mind was already envisioning uses for steam power that had never been attempted. He began experimenting with rotative motion, seeking ways to convert the back and forth motion of the steam engine's piston into the circular motion that could drive machinery. The challenge was more complex than it initially appeared. The linear motion of a steam-powered piston had to be transformed into smooth, continuous rotation without losing the power that made the engine valuable. James experimented with various mechanical linkages, each presenting its own set of problems and limitations. The solution, when it emerged, demonstrated once again James's genius for elegant engineering. The sun and planet gear system he developed converted linear motion to rotative motion with remarkable efficiency, while the parallel motion linkage he invented allowed the piston to maintain perfect alignment throughout its stroke. These innovations, seemingly minor mechanical details, were actually revolutionary advances that opened entirely new applications for steam power. By the early 1780s, Boulton and Watt steam engines were powering textile mills, flour mills, breweries, and ironworks across Britain. The transformation was visible everywhere. Factories that had previously relied on water wheels or windmills for power could now operate continuously, regardless of weather or water flow. Production capacity increased dramatically, while costs fell steadily. The economic impact was staggering. Industries that had been constrained by geographical limitations suddenly found themselves free to locate wherever labour and materials were most advantageous. Cities began to grow around steam-powered factories, creating new patterns of settlement and employment that would define the industrial age. James watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The quiet instrument maker who had struggled to repair a broken model steam engine had unleashed forces that were reshaping British society. His engines were creating wealth on a scale that previous generations could not have imagined, but they were also disrupting traditional ways of life with a ruthlessness that troubled his gentle nature. The financial rewards were substantial. The partnership with Boulton was generating profits that made James one of the wealthiest men in Britain. But wealth brought its own complications. He found himself drawn into patent disputes with competitors who sought to circumvent his innovations. He faced constant pressure to improve and refine his engines as customers demanded ever greater efficiency and reliability. More challenging still was the burden of fame. James had never sought public attention, preferring the quiet satisfaction of solving technical problems to the acclaim of society. But his steam engine had made him a celebrity throughout the scientific and industrial communities. Visitors came from across Europe to see the engines in operation and to meet the man who had created them. The recognition was gratifying, but it came at a cost. James found it increasingly difficult to find time for the experimental work that had always been his greatest pleasure. The demands of commercial production left little opportunity for the kind of open-ended investigation that had led to his greatest discoveries. Yet even as he struggled with the pressures of success, James continued to innovate. He developed the double-acting engine, which used steam pressure on both sides of the piston to increase power output. He invented the centrifugal governor, an automatic speed control system that allowed engines to maintain steady operation without constant human intervention. He created the pressure gauge, the revolution counter, and dozens of other devices that improved engine performance and reliability, each innovation built upon previous discoveries, demonstrating the cumulative nature of technological progress. James was not just improving individual components, but creating an integrated system of steam power technology that would dominate industrial development for generations. The personal costs of this intense focus on innovation were significant. James's health, never robust, deteriorated under the constant pressure of technical challenges and commercial demands. His second marriage, to Anne MacGregor in 1777, provided emotional stability and domestic happiness, but it could not eliminate the stress of managing a rapidly growing business while pushing the boundaries of engineering knowledge. The 1780s marked the peak of James's creative output. Working 18-hour days, he refined every aspect of steam engine design, from the fundamental thermodynamic principles that governed operation to the smallest mechanical details that determined reliability. His workshop notebooks from this period reveal a mind operating at the very limits of human capability, tackling problems that would have defeated teams of modern engineers. The impact of these innovations extended far beyond the engines themselves. The precision manufacturing techniques developed for steam engine production advanced the entire field of mechanical engineering. The metallurgical knowledge gained from working with high-pressure steam improved methods for producing iron and steel. The mathematical analysis required for engine design contributed to the development of thermodynamics as a scientific discipline. By 1790, Boulton and Watt engines were operating throughout Britain and beginning to spread to continental Europe and the American colonies. The company had become the dominant force in steam power technology, with a reputation for quality and innovation that commanded premium prices in every market. Yet James remained essentially unchanged by his success. He continued to live modestly, to work with his hands as well as his mind, and to approach each new problem with the same methodical precision that had characterized his earliest instrument-making projects. Fame and wealth had not corrupted the essential character that had made his achievements possible. The steam engine technology that James had developed was beginning to find applications that he had never imagined. Inventors and entrepreneurs across Britain were experimenting with steam-powered vehicles, steam-powered boats, and even steam-powered aircraft. The power source that had begun as an improved mine pump was evolving into the foundation for an entirely new form of civilization. But perhaps the most significant development was the growing recognition that steam power represented more than just a technological advancement. It was becoming clear that James's innovations had unleashed forces that would transform not just industry, but society itself. The concentration of power that steam engines made possible was creating new forms of economic organization, new patterns of social relationships, and new possibilities for human achievement. The young man who had left Scotland with dreams of becoming an instrument maker had become something far greater. He had become the architect of the modern world, the man whose genius had given humanity dominion over forces that had previously been beyond human control. And yet, despite all his achievements, James Watt's greatest contributions to human progress were still to come. The decade of the 1790s brought James Watt to the pinnacle of his influence, but also confronted him with challenges that tested every aspect of his character. The steam engine that had begun as a solution to mining problems was now driving a transformation so profound that contemporaries struggled to comprehend its implications. Yet with this success came responsibilities that weighed heavily on a man who had always preferred the quiet certainty of mechanical problems to the messy complexities of human affairs. The Boulton and Watt partnership had evolved into something approaching a monopoly on efficient steam power. Their engines were not merely superior to the competition, they were revolutionary improvements that rendered older technology obsolete. This dominance brought enormous profits, but it also attracted the kind of scrutiny and criticism that James had never anticipated when he first began tinkering with that broken model in Glasgow. Patent disputes became a constant source of stress. Competitors across Britain attempted to circumvent James's innovations through clever modifications and legal challenges. Each case required detailed technical testimony, forcing James to spend countless hours in courtrooms explaining the intricacies of steam engine design to judges and juries who barely understood basic mechanical principles. The most significant challenge came from Jonathan Hornblower, an engineer who claimed to have independently developed improvements similar to James's separate condenser. Hornblower's compound engine used multiple cylinders operating at different pressures, a design that potentially infringed on James's patents while offering genuine technical advantages. The legal battle consumed years and cost both sides enormous sums. James found himself drawn into a world of lawyers and legal precedents that was as foreign to him as his steam engines were to the general public. The stress of these proceedings, combined with the technical demands of continuous innovation, pushed his health to the breaking point. Yet even as patent disputes raged in the courts, the practical impact of steam power continued to accelerate. By 1795, Boulton and Watt engines were powering over 500 installations across Britain. Cotton mills that had once depended on water wheels now operated around the clock, producing textiles at volumes and prices that were transforming global trade patterns. The social implications of this industrial transformation were becoming impossible to ignore. Traditional craftsmen found their skills obsolete as steam-powered machinery could produce goods faster and cheaper than human hands. Rural populations migrated to industrial centres in unprecedented numbers, creating urban concentrations that challenged every assumption about how human societies should be organised. James watched these developments with growing unease. The quiet instrument maker who had sought only to solve technical problems found himself inadvertently responsible for social changes that affected millions of lives. The power he had unleashed was creating wealth and opportunity on an unprecedented scale, but it was also disrupting communities and traditions that had endured for centuries. The ethical dimensions of technological progress became a source of constant reflection for James. He corresponded extensively with fellow members of the Lunar Society, a remarkable group of intellectuals that included Joseph Priestley, Erasmus Darwin, and Josiah Wedgwood. Their discussions ranged far beyond technical matters to encompass philosophy, politics, and the moral responsibilities of those who possessed the power to reshape society. These conversations provided James with a framework for understanding his role in the broader sweep of human progress. The Lunar Society members shared a belief in the power of reason and scientific inquiry to improve the human condition, but they also recognized that progress came with costs that had to be carefully weighed against benefits. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, added urgency to these philosophical discussions. The violent overthrow of traditional authority across the English Channel raised questions about whether technological change might trigger similar upheavals in Britain. Conservative critics began to argue that steam power and industrial development were undermining the social stability that had made British prosperity possible. James found himself caught between conflicting pressures. Radicals praised him as a liberator who had given humanity new sources of power and opportunity. Conservatives blamed him for disrupting traditional relationships between masters and workers, landlords and tenants, urban and rural populations. Neither characterization felt accurate to a man who had simply sought to build better engines. The personal toll of these public controversies was substantial. James had always been a private person who preferred mechanical problems to human politics. The constant attention and criticism wore on his nerves and contributed to the chronic health problems that had plagued him since childhood. His workshop at Soho became a refuge from these pressures. Among his tools and instruments, James could return to the pure problem-solving that had always given him the greatest satisfaction. He continued to refine steam engine design, developing new solutions to persistent challenges while exploring entirely new applications for steam power. One area that particularly captured his imagination was the possibility of steam-powered transportation. James had long recognized that his engines could potentially propel vehicles, but the technical challenges seemed insurmountable. The engines were too heavy and consumed too much fuel to be practical for most transportation applications. Yet he persevered with characteristic determination. Working with his son James Watt Jr., who had inherited much of his father's mechanical aptitude, he developed lighter, more efficient engine designs specifically intended for mobile applications. Their experiments included steam carriages, steamboats, and even theoretical designs for steam-powered flight. The breakthrough in marine applications came through collaboration with other inventors who shared James's vision of steam transportation. Robert Fulton, the American engineer who would later achieve fame with his steamboat designs, corresponded extensively with James about the technical requirements for successful steam navigation. These discussions revealed the complexity of applying steam power to transportation. The engines had to be not only efficient but also compact, reliable, and capable of operating under conditions far more variable than those found in stationary installations. Every component had to be redesigned for mobile operation, from the boiler that generated steam to the mechanical linkages that converted power to motion. James's contributions to transportation technology were more theoretical than practical during his active career. The steam carriages and boats he helped design were technological marvels, but they remained experimental curiosities rather than commercial successes. The infrastructure and supporting technology needed for steam transportation would not emerge until after James had stepped back from active innovation. Yet his influence on transportation development was profound. The engineering principles he established, the manufacturing techniques he pioneered, and the thermodynamic understanding he advanced provided the foundation upon which later inventors would build successful locomotives and steamships. The 1800s brought changes that forced James to confront the inevitable transition from active innovation to elder statesmanship. His patents were expiring, opening the steam engine market to competitors who had spent decades studying and improving upon his designs. The Boulton and Watt monopoly was ending, but the company's reputation for quality and innovation ensured continued success in an increasingly competitive marketplace. James began to delegate more responsibility to his son and to the skilled engineers who had grown up within the Boulton and Watt organization. This transition was not easy for a man who had personally overseen every aspect of engine design and production for decades, but it was necessary for both his health and the company's future. The gradual withdrawal from day-to-day business operations allowed James to pursue interests that had been neglected during the intense years of steam engine development. He returned to his first love, scientific instrumentation, developing new devices for measurement and analysis that incorporated lessons learned from decades of steam engine work. His later inventions included improvements to surveying instruments, advances in chemical analysis equipment, and innovations in precision manufacturing that would influence industrial development for generations. These contributions, while less dramatic than the steam engine, demonstrated the breadth of James's mechanical genius and his continued commitment to advancing human knowledge. The recognition that came with these later years was gratifying but also bittersweet. James received honours from scientific societies across Europe, including election to the Royal Society of London and corresponding memberships in academies from Paris to St. Petersburg. Visitors from around the world made pilgrimages to Birmingham to meet the man whose inventions had transformed their nation's economies. Yet James remained fundamentally unchanged by fame and acclaim. He continued to work with his hands, to experiment with new ideas, and to approach each problem with the same methodical precision that had characterized his earliest instrument-making projects. The wealth and recognition were welcome, but they had not altered the essential character that had made his achievements possible. The industrial transformation that James had initiated was now beyond any individual's control. Steam power had become the foundation for a new form of civilization, one that would continue to evolve long after its principal architect had passed from the scene. Factories powered by steam were producing goods that reached markets on every continent. Transportation systems based on steam technology were beginning to shrink distances that had previously seemed insurmountable. As James entered his 70s, he could survey a world that had been fundamentally transformed by his innovations. The quiet instrument maker who had struggled to repair a broken model steam engine had lived to see his improvements become the driving force behind the greatest economic and social transformation in human history. But the complete life of James Watt encompassed more than technical achievement. It was the story of a man who had remained true to his principles while navigating the complexities of commercial success and public fame. It was the biography of someone who had used extraordinary gifts, not for personal aggrandizement, but for the advancement of human knowledge and capability. The workshops and factories that bore the Bolton and Watt name were producing steam engines that powered industries across the known world. The manufacturing techniques pioneered in Birmingham were being adopted by competitors and collaborators alike. The thermodynamic principles that James had developed through practical experimentation were being refined by theoretical scientists into the mathematical foundations of a new branch of physics. Yet for all these achievements, James Watt remained at heart what he had always been, a craftsman who found deep satisfaction in solving mechanical problems with elegance and precision. The recognition and wealth were appreciated, but they were not the true measure of a life devoted to understanding and improving the mechanical world. The Industrial Revolution that James had unleashed was beginning to reveal its darker complexities as the new century dawned. While his steam engines powered unprecedented prosperity, they also concentrated workers into conditions that challenged every assumption about human dignity and social responsibility. The gentle inventor who had sought merely to improve mechanical efficiency found himself grappling with moral questions that had no clear technical solutions. Reports filtered back to Birmingham from the industrial centres where Bolton and Watt engines operated around the clock. Children as young as 6 worked 14-hour shifts in textile mills, their small fingers nimble enough to tie broken threads while massive steam-powered machinery thundered around them. Adults laboured in conditions that would have horrified previous generations, breathing air thick with cotton fibres and mechanical lubricants, their lives regulated by the relentless rhythm of steam-driven production. James read these accounts with growing distress. The power he had given to industry was being used in ways that troubled his conscience deeply, yet he also understood that the alternative was not necessarily better. The agricultural poverty that steam-powered industry was displacing had been grinding and hopeless in its own way. Rural families that had barely survived on subsistence farming now earned wages that, while modest, offered possibilities for advancement that had never existed before. The complexity of these moral calculations weighed heavily on a man who preferred the clean certainty of mechanical problems. Steam pressure could be calculated precisely. Thermal efficiency could be measured objectively. But the human cost of industrial progress resisted such quantification, forcing James to confront the limits of technical thinking in addressing social challenges. His correspondence from this period reveals a man wrestling with questions that would define debates about technology and society for generations to come. Letters to fellow members of the Lunar Society explored whether inventors bore responsibility for the uses to which their creations were put. Discussions with religious leaders examined whether mechanical progress was compatible with spiritual values. Conversations with political economists analysed whether industrial development inevitably required the exploitation of workers. These philosophical struggles were complicated by James's continuing involvement in technical development. Even as he questioned the social implications of steam power, he could not resist pursuing improvements that would make engines more efficient, more reliable, and more widely applicable. The inventor's compulsion to solve problems was stronger than his concerns about their consequences. His workshop at Soho became a laboratory for innovations that would define the next phase of industrial development. Working with his son and a team of skilled engineers, James developed high-pressure steam engines that were smaller and more powerful than anything previously achieved. These advances opened possibilities for applications that had been technically impossible with earlier designs. The high-pressure engines required entirely new approaches to safety and control. Steam pressures that could drive more compact machinery also posed greater risks of catastrophic failure. James found himself pioneering safety valve designs, pressure monitoring systems, and emergency shutdown procedures that would become standard throughout the industry. The technical challenges were immense, but they pale compared to the manufacturing difficulties. High-pressure operation demanded materials and construction techniques that pushed beyond the capabilities of existing metalworking technology. James worked with iron founders and steel makers to develop alloys that could withstand the stresses involved. He collaborated with precision toolmakers to create manufacturing equipment capable of the tolerances required. Each advance in steam engine technology created ripple effects throughout the industrial economy. More efficient engines reduced fuel costs, making steam power economical in applications where it had previously been prohibitively expensive. Smaller engines enabled steam power to be used in workshops and small factories that had been unable to justify the investment in earlier, larger systems. The multiplication of steam-powered facilities accelerated the transformation of British society in ways that James could observe from his Birmingham workshop. Villages grew into towns as workers migrated to take advantage of industrial employment. Towns expanded into cities as steam-powered transportation made it possible to supply larger populations with food and materials from distant sources. The railroad development that would define the mid-19th century was beginning to emerge from experimental projects scattered across Britain. James watched with fascination as engineers adapted his steam engine designs for locomotive applications, solving problems of mobile operation that he had explored theoretically but never fully implemented. The collaboration between stationary and mobile steam applications created synergies that accelerated development in both areas. Improvements in locomotive boilers enhanced the efficiency of factory engines. Advances in factory engine controls improved the reliability of transportation systems. The entire field of steam technology was evolving through the cross-fertilization of different applications. James's role in this expanding technological ecosystem was changing from direct invention to consultation and guidance. Younger engineers brought him problems that required his unique combination of theoretical understanding and practical experience. He became a mentor to a generation of innovators who would carry steam technology far beyond what he had originally envisioned. The transition from active inventor to elder advisor was not always smooth. James had spent decades solving problems through direct experimentation and hands-on development. The collaborative approach that characterized later steam engine advancement required him to trust others, to implement his ideas, and to accept that their solutions might differ from his own approaches. Yet this evolution also brought satisfactions that James had not anticipated. Watching his students and colleagues develop innovations that surpassed his own achievements provided a different kind of fulfillment than personal discovery. The knowledge that his work had established foundations upon which others could build gave him confidence that his contributions would endure long after his own active involvement ended. The international recognition that accompanied James's later years brought opportunities to influence steam engine development beyond Britain's borders. Correspondence with engineers across Europe and America allowed him to share technical knowledge while learning about applications and innovations that were emerging in different industrial environments. French engineers were adapting steam technology for applications that reflected their nation's different industrial priorities. German manufacturers were developing precision techniques that enhanced the reliability of steam-powered machinery. American inventors were creating steam systems suited to the vast distances and abundant resources of their expanding continent. Each international exchange enriched James's understanding of steam technology's potential, while revealing the diverse ways that different cultures approached mechanical innovation. The steam engine that had emerged from British mining needs was being transformed by global application into something far more versatile and powerful than its origins suggested. The economic implications of this international steam engine development were staggering. Nations that adopted steam technology gained enormous advantages in manufacturing productivity, transportation efficiency, and military capability. Those that failed to embrace steam power found themselves increasingly disadvantaged in competition with more technologically advanced rivals. James watched this global transformation with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The power he had unleashed was reshaping the balance between nations just as it had transformed the relationship between social classes within Britain. Steam technology was becoming a source of national strength that could determine the outcome of economic competition and military conflict. The responsibility implied by this influence troubled James throughout his later years. The quiet instrument maker had inadvertently become one of the most consequential figures in human history, but he had never sought such influence and was not entirely comfortable with its implications. The mechanical problems that had always fascinated him were proving to have consequences that extended far beyond the workshop. His personal life during this period provided some refuge from these larger concerns. His marriage to Anne McGregor had brought stability and happiness that helped him cope with the pressures of fame and commercial success. Their home became a sanctuary where James could pursue interests that had been neglected during the intense years of steam engine development. Gardening became a particular passion, offering both physical exercise and mental relaxation that complemented his mechanical work. James applied the same methodical approach to plant cultivation that had characterized his engineering projects, experimenting with growing techniques and developing innovations in garden design that reflected his understanding of mechanical principles. The precision and patience required for successful gardening appealed to the same aspects of James's character that had made him an effective inventor. Both activities required careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the ability to learn from failure while persisting toward long-term goals. His workshop remained active throughout these later years, but the focus shifted from commercial development to pure research and experimentation. James pursued projects that interested him personally rather than those that promised commercial returns. This freedom allowed him to explore areas that had been set aside during the pressured years of establishing the steam engine business. Chemical analysis became a particular fascination, building on connections with Joseph Black and other chemist colleagues from his Glasgow years. James developed new instruments and techniques for analysing the composition of materials, work that contributed to the emerging science of chemistry, while satisfying his lifelong interest in precision measurement. The mathematical aspects of steam engine operation continued to intrigue him as well. James worked to develop more sophisticated understanding of the thermodynamic principles that govern steam power, creating theoretical frameworks that would influence the development of physics as well as engineering. These later investigations demonstrated the breadth of James's intellectual interests and capabilities. The man known primarily for steam engine innovation was equally capable in other fields of scientific and technical inquiry. His approach remained consistent across all areas, characterized by careful observation, systematic experimentation, and rigorous analysis of results. The recognition that came with advancing age brought honours that James accepted with characteristic modesty. Election to prestigious scientific societies, honorary degrees from major universities, and visits from distinguished scholars from around the world acknowledged his contributions to human knowledge and technical progress. Yet James remained essentially unchanged by these accolades. He continued to work with his hands, to approach problems with the same methodical precision that had characterized his earliest projects, and to find satisfaction in solving technical challenges regardless of their commercial or social significance. The steam engine technology that had made him famous was continuing to evolve in directions that sometimes surprised him. Applications that he had never considered were emerging as other inventors applied his principles to new problems. The foundation he had established was supporting innovations that exceeded even his ambitious vision of steam power's potential. Locomotive development was advancing rapidly as engineers solved the problems of mobile steam operation that James had identified but never fully addressed. The technical challenges were immense, requiring innovations in boiler design, mechanical transmission, and operational control that pushed beyond existing knowledge in multiple fields simultaneously. Marine steam application was progressing as well, with steamboat designs that promised to revolutionize water transportation just as locomotives were beginning to transform land travel. The combination of steam power with existing naval architecture was creating possibilities for ocean commerce and military operations that would reshape global relationships. Industrial steam application continued to expand into new sectors and geographical regions. Manufacturing processes that had never been mechanized were being transformed by steam-powered machinery. Agricultural operations were beginning to incorporate steam technology for tasks ranging from grain processing to field cultivation. Each expansion of steam technology validated James' original vision while revealing new possibilities that he had not anticipated. The power source that had begun as an improved mine pump was becoming the foundation for an entirely transformed human civilization, one in which mechanical energy could be applied to virtually any task that required sustained physical effort. The social and economic changes accompanying this technological transformation were equally dramatic. Traditional craft production was being displaced by factory manufacturing. Rural populations were migrating to industrial centres in unprecedented numbers. New forms of social organisation were emerging to manage the complexities of steam-powered industrial operations. James observed these developments with the same analytical approach he had applied to mechanical problems, seeking to understand the patterns and principles that governed social change, just as he had studied the forces that controlled steam engine operation. The insights he gained contributed to discussions among intellectuals and policymakers who were struggling to comprehend and manage the transformation that steam technology was driving. The correspondence and conversations from James's later years reveal a man who had evolved from technical specialist to social philosopher, applying the same rigorous thinking that had revolutionized steam engine design to questions about how human societies could adapt to technological change while preserving essential values and relationships. These broader concerns never displaced his fundamental interest in mechanical innovation, but they provided context that enriched his understanding of technology's role in human affairs. The steam engines that had emerged from his workshop were not just machines, but agents of historical change, whose influence would extend far beyond their immediate technical functions. As James approached his 70th birthday, he could survey a world that bore the unmistakable imprint of his innovations. The industrial landscape of Britain had been transformed by steam power. International commerce was being revolutionized by steam transportation. Military technology was being redefined by steam-powered manufacturing and logistics. Yet the man whose genius had initiated these transformations remained fundamentally the same person who had struggled to repair a broken model steam engine in a Glasgow workshop decades earlier. Success and recognition had not altered the essential character traits that had made his achievements possible: curiosity, persistence, methodical analysis, and an unwavering commitment to technical excellence. The workshops and factories that carried the Bolton and Watt name were operating across the known world, but James's greatest satisfaction still came from solving individual, technical problems with elegance and precision. The recognition and wealth were appreciated, but they were not the true measure of a life devoted to understanding and improving the mechanical world that humans had created to serve their needs and ambitions. The autumn of 1819 brought James Watt to a profound realization that would define his final years. At 83, he stood in his workshop at Heathfield, the estate he had purchased near Birmingham, surrounded by the instruments and mechanical devices that had been his constant companions for over 6 decades. The tools that had once felt like extensions of his own hands now seemed heavier. The precise movements that had once been instinctive now required conscious effort, but his mind remained as sharp as ever, perhaps even more penetrating than in his youth. The accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent solving mechanical problems had given him insights that transcended the purely technical. He could see patterns in the development of steam technology that younger engineers missed, connections between seemingly unrelated innovations that revealed the underlying logic of technological progress. The workshop at Heathfield had become something unique in the industrial world. Part laboratory, part museum, part sanctuary, it housed the most complete collection of steam engine development artifacts anywhere in existence. James had preserved every significant prototype, every failed experiment, every successful innovation that had marked his journey from instrument maker to industrial pioneer. Visitors came regularly to see these mechanical treasures, but James found that he enjoyed the conversations even more than the demonstrations. Young engineers brought him problems that challenged his experience and kept his analytical abilities sharp. Established inventors sought his perspective on developments that were pushing steam technology in directions he had never imagined. These interactions revealed how profoundly the field had evolved since his early innovations. The steam engines being developed in the 1820s operated at pressures that would have terrified the engineers of his generation. The applications being explored ranged from massive factory installations to delicate scientific instruments that required precision beyond anything previously achieved. Yet the fundamental principles remained those that James had established decades earlier. The separate condenser that had been his breakthrough innovation was still the heart of efficient steam operation. The thermodynamic relationships he had discovered through practical experimentation were being refined by mathematical analysis, but their essential validity remained unquestioned. The recognition of this continuity provided James with deep satisfaction during his final years. The work he had done in his small Glasgow workshop had established foundations that were supporting innovations he could never have anticipated. The theoretical understanding he had developed through hands-on experimentation was being confirmed by scientists whose mathematical sophistication far exceeded his own. His correspondence from this period reveals a man at peace with his achievements while remaining intellectually engaged with ongoing developments. Letters to former colleagues and younger engineers discuss technical problems with the same precision that had characterized his active years, but with a perspective enriched by decades of experience and reflection. The international recognition that had accumulated throughout his career reached its culmination during these final years. Scientific societies across Europe elected him to honorary memberships. Universities granted him degrees that acknowledged not just his technical contributions, but his influence on the broader development of human knowledge. Governments awarded him honors that recognized the economic and social transformations his innovations had enabled. James accepted these accolades with characteristic modesty, understanding that they represented appreciation not just for his individual achievements, but for the collaborative enterprise of technological development that he had helped to establish. The steam engine had never been the product of a single mind, but rather the result of countless innovations, improvements, and applications developed by engineers and inventors across multiple generations. His own role in this collaborative enterprise had been crucial but not exclusive. He had provided key insights at critical moments, but others had contributed equally important advances at different stages of development. The success of steam technology reflected the cumulative effect of many minds working on related problems, rather than the isolated genius of any individual inventor. This perspective influenced James's approach to documenting his contributions for posterity. Rather than emphasizing his personal achievements, he focused on describing the technical problems that had driven his innovations and the experimental methods that had led to solutions. His notes and correspondence from this period provide invaluable insights into the process of invention rather than just the results. The manufacturing techniques that had been developed for steam engine production were finding applications far beyond their original purpose. The precision boring methods created for engine cylinders were being adapted for firearms production. The metallurgical advances required for high-pressure boilers were improving the quality of iron and steel used throughout industry. These secondary effects of steam engine development demonstrated the interconnected nature of technological progress. Innovations in one field created capabilities that enabled advances in seemingly unrelated areas. The cumulative effect was an acceleration of technical development that was transforming the entire industrial landscape. James watched this technological acceleration with fascination and some concern. The pace of change was increasing beyond what any individual could fully comprehend or control. The steam technology that had taken him decades to develop was being improved and modified at rates that would have been inconceivable during his active years. The social implications of this accelerating change were equally profound. The industrial centres powered by steam technology were growing into cities larger than anything previously seen in human history. The concentration of population and economic activity was creating new forms of social organisation that challenged traditional assumptions about how human communities should function. The transportation revolution that James had anticipated was finally becoming reality. Locomotive technology had advanced to the point where steam-powered railways were beginning to connect distant cities with regular, reliable service. The economic and social effects were already visible as goods and people moved across distances that had previously required weeks of difficult travel. Maritime steam transportation was advancing even more rapidly. Steamships were crossing oceans with schedules that defied wind and weather, creating possibilities for international commerce and communication that were reshaping global relationships. The isolation that had previously protected and constrained different regions was being eliminated by steam-powered transportation. These developments vindicated James's early vision of steam power's potential, while revealing applications that exceeded even his optimistic predictions. The energy source that had begun as a solution to mining problems was becoming the foundation for a globally connected industrial civilization whose capabilities surpassed anything in previous human experience. The philosophical implications of this transformation occupied much of James's thinking during his final years. The power that steam technology had given to humanity was fundamentally altering the relationship between human beings and their natural environment. Activities that had previously been impossible were becoming routine. Distances that had once seemed insurmountable were being reduced to minor inconveniences. Yet this enhanced capability came with the responsibilities that society was still learning to manage. The industrial processes powered by steam technology were consuming natural resources at unprecedented rates. The concentration of production in steam-powered factories was creating social problems that had no historical precedents. The environmental effects of coal combustion, on the scale required for widespread steam operation, were beginning to become apparent. James's correspondence with fellow members of the Lunar Society during this period explored these emerging challenges with the same analytical rigor that had characterized their earlier discussions of technical problems. The questions were more complex than any mechanical puzzle, involving interactions between technology, economics, social organization, and environmental systems that defied simple analysis. The solutions, when they could be identified at all, required forms of cooperation and coordination that went far beyond what had been necessary during the early phases of STEAM development. Individual inventors and entrepreneurs could no longer address the challenges that their innovations had created. Collective action involving governments, businesses, and civil society organizations was becoming necessary to manage the consequences of technological progress. These broader concerns never overshadowed James's fundamental fascination with mechanical innovation. His workshop remained active throughout his final years, focused on projects that satisfied his intellectual curiosity rather than commercial objectives. The freedom to pursue pure research and experimentation provided satisfactions that had been impossible during the pressured years of establishing the steam engine business. Chemical analysis continued to occupy much of his attention, building on the foundation established through his collaboration with Joseph Black and other scientific colleagues. James developed new instruments and techniques for analyzing material composition, work that contributed to chemistry's emergence as a rigorous, experimental science while satisfying his lifelong interest in precision measurements. The mathematical aspects of thermodynamics also remained a source of fascination. James worked to develop more sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding the principles that governed steam operation, creating mathematical models that would influence physics as well as engineering. His approach remained characteristically practical, grounding abstract theory in experimental observation and mechanical understanding. These later investigations demonstrated the breadth of James's intellectual capabilities and the consistency of his analytical approach across different fields of inquiry. Whether working with steam engines, chemical analysis, or mathematical theory, he applied the same methods of careful observation, systematic experimentation, and rigorous analysis of results. The recognition that accompanied his advancing age brought opportunities to influence the education of future engineers and scientists. James corresponded with educators at universities across Britain and Europe, sharing insights about the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical application that had been central to his own development as an inventor. His advice consistently emphasized the importance of hands-on experimentation as a complement to mathematical analysis. The most sophisticated theoretical understanding was insufficient without the practical experience that came from building, testing, and modifying actual mechanical devices. Conversely, purely empirical approaches were limited without the theoretical frameworks that could explain why particular solutions worked and predict how they might be improved. This integration of theory and practice had been the hallmark of James's career, distinguishing his approach from both pure scientists who avoided practical applications and craftsmen who worked without theoretical understanding. The combination had enabled innovations that neither approach could have achieved independently, and James believed it would remain essential for future technological development. The international network of correspondence that James maintained during his final years provided insights into how steam technology was being adapted to different cultural and economic contexts. The applications being developed in France reflected that nation's particular industrial priorities and technical traditions. German engineers were creating innovations that drew on their strengths in precision manufacturing and theoretical analysis. American developments were perhaps most interesting to James, reflecting the unique conditions of a rapidly expanding continent with abundant natural resources and a shortage of skilled labor. The steam technology being developed there emphasized simplicity and reliability over the precision and efficiency that characterized British practice, creating solutions that were often crude but remarkably effective under frontier conditions. Each international variation on steam technology enriched the field as a whole, contributing insights and innovations that could be adapted to other contexts. The global exchange of technical knowledge was accelerating the pace of development, while ensuring that advances in any region could benefit engineers and inventors worldwide. The economic implications of this international STEAM development were reshaping global trade patterns and political relationships. Nations that had successfully adopted STEAM technology gained enormous advantages in manufacturing productivity and transportation efficiency. Those that lagged in STEAM adoption found themselves increasingly disadvantaged in economic competition with more technologically advanced rivals. James observed these geopolitical changes with the same analytical approach he had applied to mechanical problems, seeking to understand the patterns and forces that governed international relationships, just as he had studied the principles that controlled steam engine operation. The insights he gained contributed to discussions among political economists and policymakers who were struggling to comprehend the implications of technological change for national development and international cooperation. The responsibility implied by STEAM technology's influence on international relations troubled James throughout his final years. The mechanical innovations that had emerged from his workshop were affecting the balance of power between nations and the prospects for peace or conflict in ways that he had never anticipated when he first began experimenting with steam engines. Yet he also recognized that technological development was now beyond any individual's control. The knowledge and capabilities that steam technology represented had become part of humanity's collective inheritance, available to any society willing to invest the effort required to master them. The question was not whether steam technology would continue to spread, but how its benefits and challenges would be managed by the societies that adopted it. His personal relationships during these final years provided comfort and perspective that helped James cope with the complexities of his public legacy. His marriage to Anne McGregor had brought decades of happiness and stability that sustained him through both the pressures of commercial success and the philosophical challenges posed by steam technology's broader implications. Their home at Heathfield became a gathering place for family members, old friends, and distinguished visitors from around the world. The conversations that took place there ranged across subjects from technical innovation to social philosophy, creating an intellectual environment that kept James engaged with contemporary developments while providing the personal connections that enriched his later years. His children had grown into accomplished individuals who carried forward aspects of his legacy while pursuing their own interests and careers. James Watt Jr. had become a capable engineer in his own right, contributing to the continued development of the family business while demonstrating the same methodical approach to problem solving that had characterized his father's work. The continuity represented by his family's ongoing involvement in engineering and innovation provided James with confidence that his contributions would endure through future generations. The knowledge and values that had guided his career were being transmitted to successors who would adapt them to new challenges and opportunities that he could not foresee. The workshop at Heathfield remained the centre of James's daily routine throughout his final years. Each morning found him among his tools and instruments, pursuing projects that interested him personally rather than those that promised commercial returns. The freedom to follow his intellectual curiosity without external constraints provided satisfactions that had been impossible during the demanding years of establishing steam engine technology. His experimental work during this period focused on problems that had intrigued him for decades but had been set aside during more pressing commercial development. The precision measurement techniques that had been his first area of expertise continued to fascinate him, leading to innovations in scientific instrumentation that would influence research in multiple fields. The mathematical analysis of mechanical systems also occupied much of his attention, as James worked to develop more sophisticated theoretical understanding of the principles that governed steam operation and other forms of energy conversion. His approach remained characteristically grounded in experimental observation, but the theoretical frameworks he created would influence the development of physics as well as engineering. These later investigations demonstrated that James's intellectual capabilities remained undiminished by age, even as his physical energy declined. The same analytical rigor that had revolutionized steam engine design was being applied to problems that pushed the boundaries of contemporary scientific knowledge, creating insights that would benefit future generations of researchers and inventors. The legacy that James was consciously shaping during his final years extended far beyond his technical contributions to encompass the methods and values that had guided his career. Through his correspondence, his conversations with visitors, and his careful documentation of experimental procedures, he was transmitting not just knowledge, but approaches to problem-solving that would influence technological development long after his own direct contributions had ended. The integration of theoretical understanding with practical experimentation that had characterized his work represented a model for how future engineers and inventors could address the increasingly complex challenges that technological progress was creating. The patient, methodical approach to problem solving that had enabled his breakthrough innovations would remain relevant regardless of how much the specific technologies might evolve. As James approached his 80th birthday, he could survey a world that bore the unmistakable imprint of his innovations while remaining confident that his most important contributions were the intellectual and methodological foundations he had established, rather than any particular mechanical device. The steam engines that had made him famous were already being superseded by newer designs, but the principles and approaches he had developed would continue to guide technological development for generations to come. The workshops and laboratories that carried forward his legacy were scattered across the industrialized world, but they all reflected the same commitment to rigorous analysis, careful experimentation, and the integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application that had defined his career. The recognition and influence he had achieved were gratifying, but they were less important than the knowledge that his work had established foundations upon which others could build achievements that would surpass his own. The morning of August 25th, 1819, dawned grey and still over Heathfield. James Watt rose as he had for decades, moving slowly through the familiar ritual of preparing for another day in his workshop. But something felt different this morning. His hands, which had crafted the most precise instruments of his age, trembled slightly as he reached for his morning tea. The chronic headaches that had plagued him since childhood had returned with renewed intensity, accompanied by a weakness that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. Anne watched her husband with growing concern. At 83, James had remained remarkably active, his mind as sharp as ever, despite the physical frailties that came with advanced age. But the past few weeks had brought changes that could not be ignored. His appetite had diminished. His energy flagged earlier each day. Most troubling of all, the man who had always found solace in mechanical work was spending more time sitting quietly, lost in contemplation. The workshop that had been James's refuge for so many years now seemed to exhaust him. Projects that would once have occupied him for hours were abandoned after minutes. The precision work that had always given him such satisfaction became increasingly difficult as his eyesight dimmed and his hands lost their steadiness. Yet he persevered with characteristic determination, unwilling to surrender entirely to the limitations that age was imposing. His final months were marked by a series of small farewells that spoke to the breadth of relationships he had cultivated over 8 decades of extraordinary life. Old friends made pilgrimages to Heathfield to share memories and express gratitude for his influence on their careers and thinking. Former students brought news of innovations that built upon foundations he had established. Fellow members of the Lunar Society gathered for conversations that ranged across the scientific and philosophical questions that had occupied their collective attention for decades. Each visit reinforced James's understanding of how profoundly his work had shaped not just technology, but the entire intellectual culture of his era. The methodical approach to problem-solving that he had developed had influenced fields far beyond steam engine design. The integration of theoretical knowledge with practical experimentation that had characterized his career had become a model for scientific and technical investigation across multiple disciplines. The correspondence that continued to arrive from around the world provided evidence of steam technology's ongoing evolution in directions that sometimes surprised even its principal architect. Engineers in America were developing locomotive designs that pushed beyond anything attempted in Britain. French inventors were creating steam-powered machinery for applications that had never been considered. German manufacturers were achieving levels of precision in steam engine construction that exceeded even the exacting standards James had established. Yet each innovation validated principles that James had established decades earlier through his painstaking experimental work. The separate condenser remained the heart of efficient steam operation. The thermodynamic relationships he had discovered continued to govern energy conversion processes. The manufacturing techniques he had pioneered were being refined, but not fundamentally altered by successive generations of engineers. This continuity provided James with deep satisfaction during his declining months. The knowledge that his contributions would endure long after his personal involvement ended gave meaning to the physical deterioration he was experiencing. The steam engines bearing the Bolton and Watt name would eventually be replaced by newer designs, but the intellectual foundations he had established would continue to support technological development indefinitely. His family gathered around him during these final weeks with a devotion that reflected the love and respect he had earned through decades of quiet integrity. James Watt Jr. had become not just a capable engineer, but a worthy successor who would carry forward the family tradition of technical excellence combined with ethical responsibility. The grandchildren who played in the gardens at Heathfield represented a future that would inherit both the benefits and the challenges of the industrial transformation that their grandfather had initiated. The conversations that took place around James's bedside during his final days revealed the philosophical depth that had always underlain his technical achievements. He spoke of his gratitude for the opportunities he had been given to contribute to human knowledge and capability. He expressed hope that future generations would use the power that technology provided with wisdom and compassion. Most importantly, he emphasized his belief that the pursuit of understanding was itself a form of service to humanity, regardless of any practical applications that might result. On August 25, 1819, as the summer evening settled over the Midlands countryside, James Watt drew his final breath. He died peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by family members who had been witnesses to one of the most extraordinary lives in human history. The man who had transformed the world through the power of steam passed away as quietly as he had lived, without drama or fanfare, but with the knowledge that his work would continue to influence human affairs for centuries to come. The immediate response to James's death reflected the recognition that Britain had lost one of its most consequential citizens. Newspapers across the nation published lengthy obituaries that attempted to capture the magnitude of his contributions to industrial development. Scientific societies issued formal statements acknowledging the debt that contemporary knowledge owed to his experimental investigations. Political leaders recognized that the economic transformation he had enabled had fundamentally altered Britain's position in the world. Yet perhaps the most fitting tributes came from the thousands of workers whose lives had been changed by steam-powered industry. The factory operatives who earned wages that previous generations could never have imagined. The locomotive engineers who travelled distances that had once required weeks in a matter of hours. the sailors who crossed oceans with mechanical precision regardless of wind or weather. All of these people, whether they knew it or not, were beneficiaries of innovations that had emerged from James Watt's workshop. The funeral that took place at Handsworth Parish Church was attended by representatives of every aspect of British society that had been touched by steam technology. Prominent scientists and engineers came to pay their respects to a colleague whose contributions had elevated their entire field. Manufacturers and entrepreneurs acknowledged the debt that their prosperity owed to his innovations. Workers and craftsmen recognized that the opportunities they enjoyed were built upon foundations he had established. The gravestone that marks James Watt's final resting place bears a simple inscription that would have pleased the modest man who lies beneath it. Rather than elaborate claims about his achievements, it records basic facts about his birth and death, his marriage and family, his membership in learned societies. The monument relies on understated dignity rather than grandiose assertions, reflecting the character of a man who had always preferred substance to showmanship. But the true monument to James Watt was not carved in stone. It was built in iron and steel in the thousands of steam engines that powered the industrial transformation he had initiated. It was visible in the factories and mills, the locomotives and steamships, the entire technological infrastructure that had emerged from his breakthrough insights about steam power efficiency. Most importantly, it was embodied in the intellectual traditions he had established. The methodical approaches to problem solving that would continue to drive innovation long after the specific technologies he had created became obsolete. The world that James Watt left behind was fundamentally different from the one into which he had been born. The Scotland of his childhood had been a largely agricultural society, where power meant wind, water, and muscle. The Britain of 1819 was the world's first industrial nation, powered by steam engines that could work continuously regardless of weather or season. The transformation was so complete that it was difficult for contemporaries to remember what life had been like before steam power became available. Yet the changes that James had witnessed during his lifetime were only the beginning of the revolution he had initiated. The steam technology that had begun with improved mine pumps would evolve into locomotives that connected continents, steamships that shrank oceans, and industrial systems that could produce goods on scales that previous generations could never have imagined. The power source that had emerged from his workshop would drive human civilization to achievements that even his visionary mind had not foreseen. The scientific principles that James had discovered through practical experimentation would be refined by theoretical physicists into the mathematical foundations of thermodynamics. The manufacturing techniques he had pioneered would evolve into precision engineering capabilities that could create mechanisms of extraordinary complexity and reliability. The integration of technical knowledge with practical application that had characterized his career would become the standard approach for addressing the increasingly sophisticated challenges that technological progress was creating. The social and economic transformations that steam power had enabled would continue to reshape human relationships in ways that extended far beyond the immediate effects of industrial production. The concentration of workers in factory towns would create new forms of political organization and social consciousness. The acceleration of transportation and communication would break down regional isolation and create national and international markets. The wealth generated by steam-powered industry would fund educational and cultural developments that would benefit all levels of society. Yet these changes would also create challenges that James had only begun to recognize during his final years. The environmental consequences of coal combustion on an industrial scale would become apparent as steam technology spread. The social disruptions caused by rapid technological change would require new forms of cooperation and regulation to manage. The international competition enabled by steam-powered manufacturing and transportation would create tensions that could lead to conflict as well as prosperity. The complete life of James Watt thus encompasses not just the extraordinary achievements of a single individual, but the beginning of the ongoing human struggle to harness the power of technology for beneficial purposes while managing its potentially destructive consequences. The quiet instrument maker, who had sought merely to repair a broken model steam engine, had unleashed forces that would continue to shape human civilization long after his own direct involvement had ended. His legacy lived on in the workshops and laboratories where future generations of engineers and inventors would grapple with challenges that built upon foundations he had established. It was preserved in the educational institutions where his methods of integrating theoretical knowledge with practical experimentation would be transmitted to students who would carry them into new fields of investigation. Most importantly, it was embodied in the continuing human commitment to understanding and improving the mechanical world that serves our needs and ambitions. The steam age that James Watt had initiated would eventually give way to other forms of power and technology, but the intellectual and methodological contributions he had made would prove more enduring than any particular mechanical device. The careful observation, systematic experimentation, and rigorous analysis that had characterized his approach to problem solving would remain relevant regardless of how much the specific technologies might evolve. As the industrial world that he had helped to create continued its relentless expansion throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, James Watt's influence could be traced through every development that built upon the foundations he had established. The locomotives that would connect distant cities, the steamships that would shrink global distances, the factories that would produce goods for markets across continents, all descended from innovations that had emerged from his workshop at Soho and his experiments at the University of Glasgow. But perhaps his most important legacy was the demonstration that individual genius, combined with persistence and methodical investigation, could literally transform the world. The sickly child who had been confined to his father's workshop in Greenock had grown into a man whose innovations would affect every aspect of human existence. The quiet student who had struggled to establish himself as an instrument maker in Glasgow had become the architect of the modern industrial world. The complete life of James Watt stands as testimony to the power of human intelligence applied to practical problems with patience, precision, and unwavering determination. His story reminds us that the most profound changes in human affairs often emerge not from grand gestures or dramatic events, but from the quiet work of individuals who dedicate their lives to understanding and improving the world around them. In workshops and laboratories around the world, engineers and inventors continue to grapple with challenges that would have fascinated the man whose breakthrough insights about steam power efficiency had initiated the industrial age. The specific technologies have evolved beyond anything James could have imagined, but the fundamental approach remains the same: careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application. The power that James Watt had given to humanity through his innovations in steam technology had become the foundation for achievements that extended far beyond mechanical engineering. The wealth generated by steam-powered industry had funded scientific research, educational institutions, and cultural developments that had enriched human civilization in countless ways. The transportation systems made possible by steam power had connected distant regions and enabled the exchange of ideas, goods, and people on a global scale. Yet the challenges that accompanied these achievements would have troubled the gentle inventor who had always been concerned about the human consequences of technological change. The environmental degradation caused by industrial development, the social disruptions created by rapid technological change, the international tensions arising from competition for technological advantages, all represented aspects of his legacy that he would have found deeply troubling. The complete story of James Watt thus encompasses both the extraordinary achievements and the ongoing challenges that result from human attempts to harness natural forces for beneficial purposes. His life demonstrates both the tremendous potential and the serious responsibilities that accompany technological innovation, lessons that remain as relevant today as they were during the steam age he helped to create. The morning mist hung low over Handsworth Parish Church as they laid James Watt to rest, but across Britain, the steam engines he had perfected continued their relentless rhythm, breathing life into the new world he had created. The sickly child who had sat by his window in Greenock, watching the world through glass while his mind worked in ways that would set him apart forever, had become the architect of human civilization's greatest transformation. From that broken model steam engine at the University of Glasgow to the thousands of Bolton and Watt machines powering mills and mines across the globe, James had unleashed forces that would reshape every aspect of human existence. His separate condenser had done more than reduce fuel consumption by 3/4. It had given humanity dominion over mechanical power itself, freeing us from the ancient limitations of wind, water and muscle. But this was never just a story about steam engines. This was the story of how one man's insatiable curiosity, methodical precision and unwavering determination could literally transform the world. The quiet instrument maker who preferred the certainty of mechanical problems to the acclaim of society had inadvertently become one of the most consequential figures in human history. The man whose genius bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Today, every time you flip a switch, start an engine, or marvel at the machines that surround us, you are witnessing the continuation of a revolution that began in a small workshop in Scotland over 2 centuries ago. James Watt didn't just improve a steam engine. He taught us that the power to change everything lies not in grand gestures, but in the patient work of understanding how the world works and making it work better. That legacy, more than any monument of stone or metal, ensures that the complete life of James Watt will echo through every innovation yet to come.